Sometimes, when a TV series lasts for a really long time, it takes a really terrible turn. And they turn out a last season that just is god-awful. Whether it's because the writing slipped, or it started down a tangent that it just couldn't recover from, or stars and regulars left for some reason, another movie, another series, doesn't matter. There are things that cause a last season of a series that just should not have been made. With that in mind, here are 5 TV series that started off great but crashed and burned in the end. But before we begin, you can subscribe to be notified whenever we put out more great content. Number 5, Eureka, Small Town, Big Secrets was the tagline of the first 2 seasons, but after it was cancelled and moved to a different channel, things changed. It was still good for the next 2 seasons, but things just got a bit weird. They amped up the wow factor, and there's no way that a small town in Oregon could actually have all of this stuff happen and still remain secret. The biggest problem was they departed from the original premise, that they are actively trying to hide advanced technologies so that people don't get worried about the future. To continue this, they could have some random guest stars that showed up at particular times to help solve the crisis of the week model that was prevalent in the series. And they would have to come up with creative solutions to get this person's input and still keep them out of the loop. Similar to what happened with, eventually, Sheriff Carter in the pilot episode. But then again, this kind of idea can only go so far, and only a few interesting storylines that could happen with this format. But they could have interesting holiday episodes like werewolves during Halloween. Number 4, Andromeda. This is low on the list because it really didn't have that big of a following to begin with, although it was creative. For a show named after a ship, one would think that the ship would be prominent in many of the storylines. But that was simply not the case in the last season. Unlike its ancestor Star Trek, there was little in the exploration aspect of the show. They were simply trying to reunite a warring galaxy that had degraded during the time that the title ship had been lost in a singularity. The series did feel like a spiritual successor to Star Trek, the idea of all good things having to come to an end and all. It was never a powerhouse like Star Trek, but it did have its moments. But the whole spirit of the show changed in its last season. And it became like Heroes, a blessing when it was finally cancelled and put out of its misery. Sometimes you just have to end while you're ahead, and there's nothing you can do about it. Number 3, Warehouse 13. Just when it was getting good, just when they got things going the way it felt natural, they pulled the rug out from under the feet. Granted, there were some issues in the rewriting of history that they were forced to do in order to make the show work. They used this to their advantage to make compelling narratives. But there were also some problems with how the warehouse had existed for so long, and there were still artifacts from ancient history that were still out and about. Something just didn't work. This incongruity could have been explained by other groups of artifact hunters that were competing with the warehouse, some violently, some not so violently, but still a competition nonetheless. The last season, if indeed it can truly be called a last season with just 5 episodes, was really just an abomination. For one, they changed the paradigm between the 2 main characters. They had been operating under the idea that these 2 characters had originally a more of a brother-sister combo more than eventual love interests. They changed that in the last season to, yes, we do love each other, which made no sense, considering the entire rest of the series. And in fact, the ideas within this first episode could have been stretched to an entire season's worth of storylines. They just dropped the ball on that. But it actually did have its moments. It was actually compelling for what it was. All in all, they didn't just drop the ball. They threw it into a lava pit and laughed gleefully while it burned. A way they could have kept this going is keep the same formula. It was interesting. You'd been renewed for a reason. But que sera, sera. Number 2, Sliders. When 3/4 of the cast decide not to sign on for the next season, you know the series is in trouble. In fact, the only character to survive the whole series was one that was supposed to be there for only a few episodes, Rembrandt Brown. But he stayed on, continued to slide and slide and slide. And they never actually made it home. Well, they did, but that was in season 3, and they were fighting the Cro-Mags at the time, and they had to hide, but things just didn't work. This is another example of a series that just should have ended while they were ahead. Everything that could go wrong did. The writing rotted, the acting ached, the special effects turned sour, and like I said, most of the original cast did not sign on for the new season. And while they stopped the war with the Cro-Mags, not necessarily a strong but recurring villain, they had their moments and some reasonable-ish motivation to continue. And they introduced a new big bad, and it just went out with a whimper. Again, this should have ended while it was ahead. And finally, Fringe. Oh, where to begin on this dumpster fire? By the end of the 4th season, the series had tied off all of its loose ends. But Big Daddy Benjamin demanded another season, and the producers had to comply. Unfortunately for this once great series, the last season was a bit of a kick to the knockers. Few defend this last season, and I for one can't wait to tip into another project of old Jar Jar Abrams. The rest of the series notwithstanding, the last season really was its own beast. The premise of this was some sort of temporal Cold War kind of thing, in which, spoiler, the future and evolved humans, called observers, decide that they can't sustain the world as is, and so, rather than move on to a different planet or try to correct the world, they try to go back in time to conquer the past. During one of the few times in history, there is a person or group capable of defending against them. Sound great so far? Yeah. Well, it gets better. Canonically, these observers have abandoned the whole messy bit of emotions in favor of pure logic. But unlike Vulcans, they took a hard left turn at that, and as you will see, it isn't pretty. Still in spoiler territory here, the reason for the conquest of the planet of, well, different movie, is that they had polluted the planet to the point where it could no longer sustain life. But weren't they logical beings? Weren't they capable of seeing how their actions were affecting their world? Weren't they technologically superior? But sometimes the answer just doesn't come. So they look throughout history. The observers throughout the entire series were actually looking for a time to conquer so that they could conquer without causing too much damage to the timeline. But the time they decided to take over, they can't actually live in because there is not enough pollution. Come on! One would think that this logical race wouldn't destroy the world in the first place. But that is what the season wants us to believe. Not looking good, is it? Now again, they studied the past to find the right moment to strike, but I would think that the Dark Ages or the Dust Bowl, or due to their need for pollution, the Second Industrial Revolution would have been far better for them, especially considering nobody at that time had any understanding of any of the concepts that would be needed to travel through time in order to try to affect any kind of defense against them. But then again, with the ability to manipulate time comes the ability to travel vast distances to other worlds. You know, the whole space-time thing. And to think, they seek to conquer the past, not simply subvert it, not lie to people, physically conquering the past. But as humans, logical and emotional ones to boot would know, from the past, they would know that conquering always comes with resistance. You will always create partisans if you try to force your will upon another group, especially if you use violent means. Additionally, they have the ability as individuals to run futures, in which a single observer can, with pinpoint accuracy, predict, isolate, and perfectly manipulate the future of any one individual, making you wonder, how does any of them make any mistakes at all, given this great advantage. But we later learn that this ability is not innate at all. It comes from a bit of technology that can burrow itself into the brain of any human, their enemy, and given enough time would give past, less perfect humans the ability to run futures just as good, if not better, than they did. Again, one has to wonder, how is this possible for a race that can see the future, that knows the past, that don't have any messy emotions to mess with their logic? It doesn't make any sense. Well, back to the gist of the season. The Fringe team, having frozen themselves in amber, wake up in a future world supposedly completely taken over, except for a few random and isolated locations have already taken over. The observers have already taken over. So now they are tasked with finding and assembling some sort of device to change the course of future history. Yeah, really. Again, I have to ask, why go after a group of people in a time that they could even understand, let alone use your own technology against you, especially if you have any kind of choice in the matter? In the end, it's up to September, the observer that the audience is most familiar with throughout the series, to actually find and assemble and get some sort of MacGuffin to actually make it work. Throughout this search, they are hounded by the observer, Windmark, who becomes obsessed with killing them. But yet, isn't obsession an emotion? And the other observers, even his future present bosses, do nothing to investigate this clear aberration, even though they routinely discard aberrations in their maturation chambers. More on that later. Despite being prideful, yet another emotion, about their lack of emotion, his statements during an interview with one of his bosses about how the operation is going should have raised flags. In fact, if any logic was used at any point by these supposedly emotionless drones, despite the poor time pick, the resistance would have been conquered and the planet theirs within a year. But then again, this makes no sense, especially from a logical point of view. The Observer Society is based on complete uniformity, which Windmark's clear divergence would have been a warning sign that he was not conforming, but even now we know that genetic diversity, and by extension other forms of diversity, is important for a race's ability to survive. Yet, as I said, they destroy anomalies within the maturation chambers. Yes, they don't participate in sexual reproduction anymore because that's dirty. This is, of course, a big plot in changing the future history. Additionally, before they even decided to go back in time and conquer the past, with no emotions, they would have been able to see a trend in global environment and make changes, even, especially their own society at large, to keep it viable, especially for them. The message of this whole season being the overly saccharine idea that our emotions make us human, and with them we can do anything. It may be a good message for a kids show, but it comes off as pedantic and shallow in any series designed for adults, because it just makes no sense. If they needed to create another season, if they absolutely had to do some kind of war through time, there should have been a few different groups of observers, because in any civilization that gets large enough, you will have splinters develop. That's just the way of it. And each of these differing splinters would have different ideas about how to keep and change and manipulate the future to create the best outcome for their group. And this could have created a very good, compelling storyline. September being one of the first 12 to travel through time and being primed to prefer to let history happen as intended would have then become some sort of benefactor to a group like the Fringe team, who would be then tasked to keep history the same. But this would be even more compelling by having that same Fringe team being forced to protect history while at the same time preventing any changes. It would have been difficult, and we would have seen different time periods, different people, different reactions. It would have been rather interesting. This would allow us to see the team go to different times, places, and solve different problems with differing levels of technology and resources against superior opponents in order to maintain history the way it was meant to happen. Like perhaps one enemy group decided to give Genghis Khan compound bows and carbon fiber arrows, and the French team would have to figure out how to A, get those weapons away from the group, and get another group capable of fighting them while at the same time not changing history too much. Or perhaps one enemy future team would decide Project Valkyrie absolutely needed to work in order to ensure future history evolving as best as it could. Well, the Fringe team would be forced to prevent Valkyrie from happening, which again would cause a moral quandary, in which some of the main characters, perhaps Olivia, is asking, why do we have to protect one of history's most prolific killers? It doesn't make sense. But yet, it has to make sense. It has to have happened in order for us to have learned from the history, in order for that history to have happened, so that we could learn from it. Talk about moral quandaries. And in this better season, we would be able to see the team struggle to not change history as they work to sustain it the way it should be. Sure, it sounds a bit like DC's Legends of Tomorrow, but this series went off the air before the Legends landed. So it could have made it work. And maybe we could have even had an interesting crossover. I really hope you enjoyed this presentation. If you did, you can like, comment, and subscribe, and have a look through our archives. Have a great day.